Good evening. Welcome, welcome. Nice to see you all, to practice together. So today I'd like to start with this little quote that's in the suttas, where where somebody asks the Buddha a question. It seems like for me, when I hear this, it seems like a relevant question that we could just ask today, absolutely. So the question is, when beings all wish to live in peace, this recognition that all of us want peace, of course, all of us do, not only humans do, right? All beings, this is part of, I don't know, I just imagine it's part of what it means to be alive. So the question is, when beings all wish to live in peace, why are they perpetually embroiled in conflict? It's kind of a good question. Like, we all want peace, but why is there so much conflict? All over the place, in really obvious ways, and even in really subtle, quiet ways. Of course, we have like nation states, but we also have, just being irritated with the neighbor because their dog barks all the time, or something like this, right? There's this, maybe the conflict isn't obvious or, manifest in some terrible throwing things or saying things or harming, but there's this like conflict, like not getting along with, being in contention with. So why is that even though we want peace, we find ourselves in conflict? Sometimes we're even in conflict with the moment. Like, I don't want this to be happening. Make it go away. There's this way in which we're kind of like trying to push things away or change them or manipulate them, engineer them in any way we can just to make them feel more comfortable so that we don't feel like we have to be in conflict with them. So then, as you might imagine in these suttas, after that question, the Buddha gives a talk. I'm not going to go into exactly that particular sutta, but he gives this discourse where he's tracing all the causes of conflicts and hostility. And he talks about subtler and subtler, more and more subtle elements of our experience. So I finally kind of like landing on, it's our views, beliefs. Of course it is. Like, how could it be anything else? It's these ideas that we have about how things should be or how we should be, but it's not quite that simple either. Because otherwise we could just say, okay, well, we'll just change our beliefs or don't have any beliefs or anything like that, and then you wouldn't be in conflict. But somehow that doesn't quite work. There's this way in which we have these views that we're not even aware of. We're holding on to them in a way that we don't even know. And we don't want to have this approach like, oh, nothing matters, or everything's okay, and we don't need any boundaries, or we don't need to say this is okay and that's not okay. Like, we don't want to do that. So how do we find our way with this? This idea of conflict and views and beliefs. Well, first I'll start by, there's a story that the Buddha gives about himself. It's a little autobiographical, and it's a little bit different than what we usually hear about the Buddha. It's before he's awakened, and what it was like to be a young man at that time in ancient India. It's very interesting, because I can imagine that what he's saying, actually I would say that a lot of what he talks about is, we could be talking about the same thing today. Maybe not the last verse, but where he kind of talks about the way forward that he found. But it starts like this. Just look at people and their quarrels. And I will speak of my dismay in the way that I was shaken, seeing people thrash about like fish in little water. Right? There is this way that with people like thrashing about and fish in little water, there's this agitation, whether it's obvious with their body movements, but there's an agitation, this wanting to lash out or to harm or blame or, something like this. There's this quality of, a fish in little water has this little desperation to it, or this feeling like it's not going to survive. In some ways, people feel like this often too. It's not so much that they're not going to survive, but something in them feels threatened. And so they're thrashing about like fish in little water. I will speak of my dismay in the way that I was shaken, seeing people thrash about like fish in little water and seeing them feuding with each other. I became afraid. It's quite something. Somebody who becomes the Buddha says, I became afraid. Maybe I'll just say that I had some neighbors that reliably at 9 p.m. the yelling would start. And it was quite something. It was like in the summer, especially when we all have our windows open and they were close enough to me. Wow, I couldn't, understand the words, but I didn't need to. It made me so anxious at night just to hear all the yelling and I just felt like, oh, I don't know what's happening over there, but it's pretty reliably almost every night for years. So it's just so heartbreaking. And it's sad, too. So when the Buddha to be is talking about seeing them feuding with each other, I became afraid. Yeah, maybe you've had that same experience, too. There's something about when we see, even we see on social media, people are thrashing around and yelling at each other and there's some real ugly stuff that happens there. There's this kind of feeling, too, of, I don't know, is it fear? But it's something like that. This contraction and dismay. Maybe I like this word of dismay. So the Buddha says, seeing them feuding with each other, I became afraid. I felt discontent at seeing only conflict to the very end. So he felt like everywhere he could see, maybe, I don't know what it means exactly to the end, but in my mind, I'm imagining the end of time, he couldn't see that it was about to finish, it was just going to happen all the time. And maybe the end in terms of space, it doesn't matter where he had been and with whom he was with, there was plenty of conflict. It's the same as it is now. I felt discontent at seeing only conflict to the very end. Then, and now here's where they'll shift. I saw an arrow here, hard to see, embedded in the heart. It's quite something. Hard to see, right? Didn't notice it, but notice that there was this arrow, like a dart, something like stabbing in the heart. Pierced by this arrow, people dash about in all directions. When the arrow's pulled out, they don't run and they don't sink. When the arrow's pulled out, they don't run and they don't sink. They don't run and they don't sink is a reference to later, or in another discourse, somebody asks the Buddha, how did you cross the flood? How did you get through all this morass of difficulties of life? And with this metaphor of the flood, maybe a raging river, somebody asks him, how did you get across, to the other side where things are safe and spacious and free? He says, I got across the other side by not halting and by not struggling. So he's saying here, when the arrow is pulled out, it's the same thing, but they don't run and they don't sink. So it's a way to get to the other side, where there's freedom and peace and safety. I appreciate this very much because the Buddha is pointing to something that he discovered in himself. He's not saying, well, okay, all you guys, you have this problem and you got to fix it. He's saying, I was distressed. And with that, I discovered that actually there was something I was contributing to this arrow. And not only is he saying that, he is saying that other people can pull it out too. It's not just something that he did. And of course, we might even say that his lifetime of teaching was about pulling out this arrow. So we might ask, well, what is this arrow? How do we pull it out? How can we put an end to this conflict? So maybe before I answer that, I'll tell one more story, this one little more discourse that also comes out of the suttas. This is a well-known one. I think probably all of you have heard this. There's a version of this story in a number of different religious traditions. So not just Buddhism. I think from India, it's in a number of different traditions. I kind of like this idea that there's just this wisdom that was just being shared, and different traditions kind of incorporated it into their scriptures. And there's something about the version, I haven't read it in any other religious tradition, but the details of this version, I'll point out at the end, kind of makes a difference than the more sanitized version that I've heard in Dharma talks. When I went to actually read it, I thought, oh, this is an important difference here. So there's this king. When we might think of a king as just somebody who has authority. There's this king who asks a servant, and we might even think just servant as somebody who obeys the authority of somebody else. It could be a worker or whomever it is. The king asked a servant to round up persons who were blind from birth. So people had never seen. And when the servant had done so, the king asked the servant to show the blind people an elephant. Right? Elephants, huge. These are just huge. So big and powerful. So to some, of these blind people, he showed the elephant's head, to some the elephant's ear, to some the elephant's tusk, to some the elephant's trunk. You can just imagine where this is going, right? If you're a blind person and you feel a tusk, you're going to have one idea. If you have a trunk, you're going to have a different idea. So the body, the foot, the hindquarters, the tail, and even the tuft at the end of the tail. So you can imagine where this is going, right? That everybody just feels one little portion of this giant elephant. And then the king asked the blind people, what is an elephant like? Of course. Somebody says, it's like a water jar. It's like a basket. It's like an arrow. It's like a pole. It's like a storeroom. It's like a post. It's like a mortar. It's like a pestle. It's like a broom. These are all different things. But then here's what comes next. So they're saying, an elephant is like this. It's not like that. But it's not like that. It's like this. So they get to fighting all these the blind people are fighting amongst each other. And then they fought each other with fists. So they couldn't see one another, but they were flailing around and it's punching each other. And the king was delighted with the spectacle. So this was just for the amusement of this person. So maybe unlike the Buddha, who's when he's seen the conflict is feeling afraid and upset, here's somebody who's just doing it for sport. But, we do some of that, right? Maybe there's a part of us we do this too. Maybe there's some athletic events that are a little bit like this, or maybe there's politics that are like this, right? There's this way in which we kind of set up this conflict, and it's entertainment. And this is even like part of like so many like reality TV, right? This kind of stuff. So the people became quarrelsome, disputatious, and wrangling, wounding each other with verbal daggers. So they're calling each other names. And then at the end of this, then there's a little bit of a discourse, and the Buddha says, in the same way, some religious practitioners, so-called, are deeply attached to their own views. People who only see one side of thing engage in quarrels and disputes. So people who only engage in one side of things. So of course we have views, but it's something different to have views and to be holding on to them so tightly that you have to quarrel and get in fights with others and try to convince others that it's, we're right and they're wrong. So this last story, kind of with the elephant, points to this tendency that we often think that we know the truth or we know what's really happening when only we know a piece of the story. Often we don't know what's going on inside somebody else. Maybe sometimes when we're in the middle of a conflict, we aren't thinking about like the bigger picture. Like, can you imagine if how these blind people how they would have reacted if the person who was showing them the elephant said, okay, so now I'm doing this so we can do this entertainment for the king, and I'm going to tell everybody else something different, and then we're going to ask you to say what it is. So if they had like the bigger picture, they would probably say, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to go talk to these other people, and maybe we will just talk together, what is it like, or something. So this idea that we often think we have the bigger picture, but we don't. Or maybe we even have a really big picture, but we're still just holding on. But maybe we're just missing one integral piece of information that maybe we wouldn't even recognize, like from our background, our social location, our history. Like we might be biased to think about things one way and not even recognize that different people think different ways. Of course they do. How can they not? People from different family stories, cultures, whatever it is. So maybe I'll point out that we all have distorted views. Not only do we not have the big picture, but some of the views that we have are distorted about the world and about ourselves. And so we might think that we want to hold on to them, but how accurate are they? So we might think that we're the ones who see clearly, and these other people, they're just obviously confused or just don't know. Or we might have this idea that we are the ones that are upstanding and they're not, us and them, me and everybody else. Or we might have the sense that we are the aggrieved and they are the transgressors. We so often have these views, but is this the whole picture? And what are we not seeing? What are we not seeing? And here's one thing that this little exercise that this was offered as, maybe I won't give all the gory details, but here's an exercise that I did that was a little bit of an eye-opener for me. I had this kind of a realization about, some of these views that I didn't even know I was holding. And I was kind of holding on to them tightly, unknowingly. So it just starts with this. Just an exercise that we can do together. So what are the groups that we belong to? Of course we belong to groups. So you might say that, are you an employee of a certain company? And are you in a particular division within that company? You belong to that group. Or maybe you're interested in a particular hobby. Belong to that group. Maybe those hobbyists, or you have a profession, or maybe you belong to that group. And maybe you're involved or interested in the arts, and maybe you identify with a particular style or school or genre of the arts. The violin is better than the piano, or something like this. Maybe you have this certain philosophical ideas, and there's these different schools of philosophy, certain Buddhist philosophy and Buddhist tradition as well. Maybe this idea, this tradition is distinct and different than the other traditions, and I belong to this one. Or maybe, sports teams, or maybe even brand names. Apple or PC. Android or iPhone, and maybe there's like this affiliation with wanting to be with one of these, or maybe citizen of a nation, a city, community, neighborhood. We all kind of belong to these groups, a number of them. Maybe some of them we don't identify with very strongly, but we can ask ourselves, in what way is the identity of this group related to another group in some way? Is there a rival team? Is there a competitor? And I remember wow, when I was in corporate America, the department I was in, we had to partner with this other department in my department, where we were always complaining about that other department. And then as a company, we were always the rival was this other company. So there's this little bit of conflict, right? That kind of just got set up as part of being part of this group. Or do we have this common enemies, for lack of a better word, that that we're all, that provides some of the cohesiveness in this group. So there's a way in which there's this underlying beliefs just shows up in so many ways that sow the seeds for conflict, sow the seeds for us versus them, me versus you, me against the world. And so there's this quote from Michel de Montaigne. He's a French philosopher, I think in the 16th century. He says, "I consider myself an average person, except for the fact that I consider myself an average person." Right? We all kind of think that somehow we're a little bit better than average. I think there's kind of this recognition, right? Even all these hundreds of years ago. So, of course, there is nothing inherent in any person, nothing, that makes them fundamentally our enemy or competitor or something we need to be opposed. And yet we are so, easily kind of can fall into that kind of thinking. And so these are just cognitive biases that we have. I think probably all humans have them, and a person could even say that there's some evolutionary advantage to having some cohesiveness within a group, so we can take care of each other. But clinging to our views contributes to conflict. Clinging to anything leads to suffering. Of course it does. We know this. Clinging is not the way to freedom. But sometimes we have these views that we don't even recognize that we have, that we aren't even aware of. And so, what can we do? What are some ways in which we might be able to work with this? Maybe I'll start with something that Gil said a number of years ago. I think he might have said it more recently also. And this idea of be still and look upon everything kindly. There's something kind of like very simple. Be still and look upon everything kindly. So be still is pointing to, is there a way that we can stop the thrashing about like fish out of water? Which is, exaggerated. But there is sometimes this agitation, this same sense of agitation. So can we quiet the mind? Soothe the heart? So that we can see a bigger picture. Otherwise, our view is limited, definitely. Can we quiet the mind so that we can check in with our experience and notice how agitated we are? Sometimes when we're just agitated, we're lost in the agitation and don't really have any awareness of that. I know this happens for me sometimes, like when I had those neighbors that were yelling, like sometimes I would just not even be aware that I was agitated, but I would just be agitated, trying to escape from the sound. And then this idea to look upon everything kindly. Maybe we need to have to be still in order that we can look upon things kindly. There's so many different ways we might interpret this idea of look upon things kindly, but one of them is, can we soften our heart and soften our mind? Can we open up whatever is kind of like feeling constricted? Of course, there's a few ways that we can do that. One is to just check in with the body and to relax the body. Of course, the body and the mind are connected. Sometimes it's easiest to start with the body. Stretch, do something comfortable. Do some long, deep breaths or long exhales. These are ways to kind of like soften the body. These kind of like soothe the nervous system also. And then when the nervous system starts to calm down a little bit, then we can see a bigger picture and maybe soften and open the heart a little bit. What would it be like if in a conflict, even if it's something that's subtle, like this idea of identifying with one group that's opposed to another group, what would it be like to give this other group or the other individual a victory? Yeah, you're right. That's actually a good point. Oh, you're so right. Yeah, you know what? I changed my mind. I can see what you're saying now. Oh, I didn't realize that. Okay, I didn't know that other information. So now that what you're saying makes more sense. Or saying, I'm not entirely convinced, but I can see that you're convinced. So help me understand. These different ways, to maybe like give them a victory, so that then that kind of like just brings the tension down, and everybody can, maybe with some relaxation, there can be some seeing the bigger picture. I think many of us know this verse from the Dhammapada. Hatred never ends through hatred. By non-hate alone does it end. And this is an ancient truth. Of course, hatred never ends through hatred. Hatred maybe is a strong word, but it's pointing to, right, conflict isn't going to end with conflict. Where is it going to end? Why not with us? So sometimes we have these cognitive, have these biases of like me against the world, us versus them, that we aren't even aware of. They just seem so familiar that we don't even question them. But so much about this practice is starting to see some of these underlying beliefs that we have, about ourselves, about others, about the world, and just start to hold them lightly. Hold them like, okay, this is what makes sense to me now. This is my provisional understanding. Something like this, rather than just holding on tightly. And then here's an excerpt from a poem, a short poem by Rosemary Trommer. The title of this poem gives it away. It says, "Dear moment that wasn't what I thought it was." So here's a little excerpt. "Thank you for blessing me with reality, for showing me when I'm guilty of what my friend calls cognitive slippage. It's like stuffing a big scoop of wasabi into my mouth thinking it's guacamole. The mind believes what it wants to believe until it's shown otherwise." So this idea, right? Big spoonful of wasabi is really uncomfortable. Horseradish, that's, just clears a sign to say it's very uncomfortable to have a mouthful of this. Especially if you think it's guacamole, something smooth and delicious. And so it's uncomfortable. This recognition that it's uncomfortable, but it doesn't mean that we can't do it. And it doesn't mean that it's not a way to greater and greater freedom and ease, not only for ourselves, but for others, for those people that we are in conflict with. So one way to work with conflict is to be still and look upon everything kindly. Of course, to look upon things kindly means that we have this warm-heartedness. And sometimes we feel disconnected from our warm-heartedness. Mindfulness practice supports this. Loving kindness practice supports our feeling connected both to ourselves and to a sense of warm-heartedness. But also to be still might point to, are there ways that we can be more aware of our beliefs? Some of these underlying beliefs that we might have. Can we be curious and maybe inquire about, when we find ourselves in conflict, just to even ask ourselves, what beliefs am I holding here that puts me in so much conflict? Why can't I kind of like hold this with open hands? Still setting boundaries between appropriate and inappropriate behavior. We're not being passive. We're not letting people walk all over us. But we're not forcing our beliefs on others. We're holding them like this as opposed to like this. So maybe we could be curious about the beliefs and the opinions that we have. Why does that make sense to us? What's underneath them? What's underlying them? Because our beliefs are resistant to change. And if we don't have this sense of curiosity or this willingness to inquire, they'll just stay embedded, and there'll just be conflict after conflict. So be still and look upon things kindly as a way to work with conflicts, to help become aware of some of these views that we have, to help create the conditions for conflicts with others. And I'm using this word conflict, of course, right, in a really general way. Just mild irritation to really just giant, as big as you can imagine. So maybe I'll stop there and then open it up to see if there's some questions or comments.
I'm really intrigued by the verse from the Dhammapada about only by non-hate. Because every other religion says difference in why not hating my neighbor is enough.
Yeah. And sometimes translators will say, do this love, they will, but the Pali is not hate, unhate. And I like this very much for the same reason. Can you imagine why it's just not hating is it's good enough?
I know what I'd like it to be.
Okay, well,
That I don't have to come up with the love, that somehow by non-hating, by putting aside hate, setting that aside, there's space inside me, and the love emerges naturally, rather than me having to do it.
very nice.
So I don't have to, well, that's it.
Very nice, very nice. I appreciate this very much, and I would say that's definitely part of what it's there. But love is a tall order, right? I think often when we hear like love thy neighbor, especially like when we're having difficulties, it feels like we can't relate to that. It feels like a disconnect. Like, how am I going to get there when I'm over here with this real anger or hatred or something?
It's harder than that, because it's not just love thy neighbor, it's love thy neighbor as thyself.
I see, yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, right. So non-hate ends with this conflict here, right? So it's not that it's just the ending of conflict. It's more like honoring and respecting, which isn't the same thing as loving. It's kind of like, okay, this is I'm not in conflict with them, as opposed to loving them like myself or thyself. Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Yes, back here.
I just wanted to make a comment. Thank you. I think for me, the concept of not hating someone, what it means to me very deeply, and it took me a long time to figure out, is hating someone, the amount of energy it takes and the amount it takes away from me and my essence, just is not worth the conflict or the hatred, whatever you might call it.
Yeah.
I'm not even thinking about having a positive love or for that person. I just don't want to be depleted anymore.
Yeah. And not to be tangled up, right? When there's a hatred, then you're tangled up with them in some kind of way. And yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
When you got to the part of the story about your neighbors and said that went on for years,
Yes.
something in me just died of sadness.
Yeah.
Did it ever turn out okay?
They moved away. And in the
Together?
winter, we couldn't hear so well because our windows were closed. But in the summer, where we have our windows open and we could hear, so I don't know, maybe they got along better in the winter. But I don't know. couldn't hear.
I used to drive a cab in San Francisco, and once I was driving along and looked out the window. If it helps to set the scene, it was on Sutter Street around Hyde, going westbound, north side of the street. And there was two people, a man and a woman, walking along side by side and yelling at each other bitterly. And you could see this was a very sustained thing. And I looked at my passenger in the back seat and said, that's just so completely unnecessary.
Yeah.
And he agreed right off the bat.
It's quite something that you remember this, right, all these years later, because it touched something. This is kind of what the Buddha was pointing to also. It touches something when we see this. Yeah.
I mean, they could just, if they're not happy with each other, just part and go different ways. But for some reason, people don't do that.
Actually, I wanted to follow on that. In the summer of 1973, I was going out with a woman that lived in an apartment, and the apartment above her there was a couple that fought all the time. And it turns out the story was they fought all the time, so they got divorced. And then they missed each other, so they got married again, moved in, and still fought. So it made me think, there's something, it's kind of like sometimes people like their patterns so much that it isn't like not having it is worse than having the conflict for some. So it's, I think there's certainly a place for compassion. In that. And also seeing that it's not just them, that certainly there's ways in which I seek conflict. Not like going to a boxing match, but there is I can see in myself a tendency leaning towards that occasionally.
There's a little zing of energy that comes with that. Yeah. I could see, why we do this, right? So, Thank you, Jim. 1973. So you remember all these years later also, right? This people being in conflict.
Yeah, well, it was so amazing to me that they actually got divorced, went apart, and then got married again so they could be back together in that same dynamic. And it was like, there's some valence there. There's something.
Maybe psychologists have something to say about that, but thank you. That's right, movie stars, right, are doing this, Any last comments? I think Cater here has a...
What you were saying makes me think of my family, my birth family, my mother and my sisters. And aggressive communication is kind of the norm. So I've tended to not spend time with them because I don't like it. But I've learned to not take it personally. It took a lot. I've learned that it really has absolutely nothing to do with me. It's how they need to. It's all them and how they need to communicate. And sometimes I don't like to speak aggressively, but sometimes it's like they don't feel met or heard or seen unless you raise your voice. So sometimes it's like, it's just meeting the energy. Sometimes, it's like a dance, it's like an involvement. It's like, now I know that you see me, which is not how I like to be. But I can also see that it's just meeting them, right? It's just like, that's what they need to know, oh, okay, you hear me and you see me, and And so then there becomes this challenge to be able to communicate in that without actually, then it's really easy to without actually becoming angry, right? There doesn't have to be any angry, right? It's just meeting the expression, the mode of expression.
So meeting the energy and not having it be anger or ill will.
Because it's really easy when you get back in that mode for that old habit energy to arise, right? So it's a very interesting dance to just notice how people communicate and then not take it personally and then kind of, what does this situation need? So I don't avoid it as much. I would really because they're my family, they're my birth family, and I don't want to, I've learned, sometimes we need to get together. But it's not my personal preference, right? It's interesting, the compelling nature of habit energy.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. Wishing you all a wonderful rest of the evening. Good night.